Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, there once sailed a fleet known as Invincible. It carried the pride of the Japanese Empire, massive aircraft carriers and pilots who believed they were born to rule the skies. But within just 2 years, everything changed. From Midway, where 4 Japanese carriers were engulfed in flames, to the Philippine Sea, where Japan's air power was wiped out in a single day, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And finally, to Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history, where the remnants of Japan's Navy vanished in despair. 3 battles, 3 decisive blows that erased Japan's naval power from the Pacific. This is the journey from the heights of arrogance to the depths of defeat. A story of America's rise and the downfall of an empire at sea. In December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled, multiple battleships were sunk, and more than 2,000 sailors were killed. After that blow, Japan rapidly expanded across Asia and the Pacific, seizing Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and even pushing into the Indian Ocean. Within 6 months, they seemed unstoppable. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were fortunate not to be present at Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. They remained the only major force intact and quickly became Japan's prime target for elimination. The Imperial Navy devised a bold plan to seize Midway, a small atoll in the Central Pacific, more than 1,000 kilometers from Hawaii. They believed the United States would be forced to deploy all its carriers to defend Midway, and in doing so, walk into a trap. What Japan did not know was that the Americans had broken their naval code, JN-25. The entire Midway operation had been exposed. Admiral Chester Nimitz quietly positioned his 3 carriers to the east of the island, ready to ambush the Japanese fleet. In early June 1942, both sides moved into position. On one side stood 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same warships that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. On the other side, the 3 remaining American carriers, supported by Midway's defenses. 2 fleets were now on course for a decisive clash, a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. Early morning, June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean lay quiet in darkness, broken only by the sound of waves against the ships. On the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, flagship of the Japanese fleet, sailors and pilots moved steadily under red lights. Bombers and fighters were rolled out, lined up, and made ready for launch. The atmosphere across the ship was tense and urgent. At 4:30 a.m., the order to launch was given. Engines roared to life. Aircraft lifted off one after another into the night sky. From the 4 main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, a total of 108 planes took off, including Zero fighters, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. Their course was set southeast, toward Midway Island. At the same time on Midway, the morning began normally. Suddenly, radar detected multiple signals approaching from the northwest. At 5:45 a.m., air raid alarms sounded across the island. Defenders rushed to their positions. Anti-aircraft guns were loaded. The Marine fighter squadron on the island, consisting only of a few F-4F Wildcats and F-2A Buffaloes, took off to intercept. Around 6:20 a.m., the Japanese strike force appeared over Midway. Zero fighters circled in escort while groups of D-3A dive bombers broke formation and began their attack runs. Meanwhile, B-5Ns flew in low from the sea. The first bombs struck the runway and barracks, shaking the island. American troops scrambled for cover as anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of black smoke. A handful of Marine fighters attempted to engage but were quickly shot down by the Zeros. With air superiority secured, Japanese bombers continued their attack. Fuel tanks, hangars, radio stations, and the power plant were all hit, causing multiple large explosions. One bomb struck the ammunition depot, detonating with force strong enough to destroy the control tower. Several defensive positions and anti-aircraft guns were eliminated. After roughly 15 minutes of bombardment, the Japanese planes withdrew to their carriers. Midway was left burning, its runway heavily damaged, large areas aflame, and dozens of American personnel killed or wounded. Yet the base was not completely neutralized. The runway remained usable to some extent, and several anti-aircraft batteries were still in action. For the U.S. defenders, it was clear the battle had only just begun. Immediately after the Japanese bombing raid ended, the United States launched what remained of its air forces to counterattack. Earlier, taking advantage of the time before the enemy arrived, Midway's commanders had already ordered several aircraft to search for the Japanese fleet. Now, despite the heavy damage to the base, every aircraft still operational was ordered into the air. The American pilots understood that if they did not strike back now, they might not get another chance. At 7:10 a.m., over the waters near the Japanese carrier formation, 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers approached at low altitude. They flew in 2 sections, using cloud cover and smoke to penetrate the outer defenses. Behind them came 4 B-26 Marauder medium bombers, also carrying torpedoes. As they closed in, Japanese anti-aircraft fire erupted, and more than a dozen Zero fighters dived to intercept. One Avenger was destroyed in mid-air. The others pressed on and released their torpedoes, but the Japanese carriers evaded every attack through sharp maneuvering. One B-26, heavily damaged and on fire, lost control and nearly crashed into the carrier Akagi, passing just meters from its flight deck before plunging into the sea. By the end of the strike, only 1 Avenger and 2 B-26 returned to Midway, all badly damaged. At 7:45 a.m., another group attacked from a different direction. Marine Corps dive bombers, led by Major Lofton Henderson. Their formation consisted of SBD Dauntless and outdated SB-2U Vindicator aircraft targeting the carrier Hiryu. Lacking experience, the pilots used shallow glide bombing instead of steep dives, making them easy targets. 9 Japanese Zeros quickly engaged, shooting down several planes. Major Henderson was killed when his Dauntless was hit and crashed into the sea. The remaining bombers released their payloads, but none hit the target. Only near misses were recorded. A few aircraft managed to retreat to Midway, heavily damaged. With 2 American attacks repelled, the skies briefly fell silent. Smoke and debris marked the waters below. Within less than an hour, the Japanese fleet had defeated 2 separate strikes from Midway, losing only a handful of fighters while the American attackers were nearly annihilated. At 8:10 a.m., another threat appeared at high altitude. 12 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers arrived at 6,000 meters and dropped bombs on the Japanese fleet. The long fall gave Japanese ships enough time to maneuver. Towering water columns erupted around the vessels, but none of the bombs struck home. The fleet remained intact. At 8:30 a.m., a further attack came in. 11-volt SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers from Midway targeted the battleship Haruna. Flying slowly into heavy anti-aircraft fire, they released their bombs, which again only splashed into the sea nearby. 2 Vindicators were shot down. The remainder jettisoned their bombs and withdrew. Throughout the morning of June 4th, All air attacks launched from Midway failed. Not a single bomb or torpedo struck the Japanese fleet. However, the repeated American assaults, though ineffective, began to place significant pressure on Japanese command. On the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a dilemma. At 8:20 a.m., he received a report from a scout plane that American carriers had been sighted northeast of Midway. At the same time, the leader of the Midway strike force reported that the island base was still operational and required another attack. Nagumo was caught between two options: rearming aircraft with bombs for a second strike on Midway, or preparing them with torpedoes for an attack on the U.S. fleet. While he hesitated, further American raids from Midway arrived, disrupting operations. Japanese aircraft returning from earlier missions had to dodge bombs and were hastily repositioned for relaunch. Near misses forced flight deck crews to halt their work temporarily. In the air, Zero pilots, exhausted after continuous combat, were running low on fuel and ammunition. These disruptions delayed Nagumo's decisions. Precious minutes slipped away, minutes that would prove critical for the fate of the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, to the northeast, the U.S. Navy was preparing its counterstrike. Thanks to intelligence gained from code-breaking, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned American carrier forces in advance near Midway. On the morning of June 4th, two carrier groups commanded by Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance maneuvered into position roughly 200 miles east of the Japanese fleet. The American force consisted of three carriers: Enterprise and Hornet, Task Force 16, and Yorktown, Task Force 17. Once reconnaissance confirmed the Japanese carrier's position, orders to launch were issued. Beginning around 7 a.m., the flight decks of the American carriers bustled with activity. Aircraft were catapulted into the air in successive groups. In total, over 100 planes, including F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless, dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, took off, heading toward the Japanese formation with the aim of delivering a decisive blow. At 9:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, consisting of 15 TBD Devastators, was the first to make contact with the Japanese carriers. Lacking fighter escort, they attacked immediately. Flying at low altitude, they approached from the southeast. More than 20 Zero fighters pounced as soon as they were detected. Despite being outnumbered, the Devastators held formation, pressing through heavy anti-aircraft fire and relentless attacks from the Zeros. One by one, the lumbering torpedo planes were shot down. A handful managed to reach launch range and dropped their torpedoes at the carrier Surigao. Explosions erupted in the water, but none struck their target. Within minutes, the squadron was virtually annihilated. 14 of 15 aircraft were destroyed. Of the 30 pilots and crew, 29 were killed. Only one young pilot survived, thrown clear when his aircraft went down. Clinging to a life raft amid oil-slicked waves, he watched as the battle raged on in the skies above. Immediately after Torpedo Squadron 8, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown also launched attacks against the Japanese fleet. Their results were the same. Nearly all of the torpedo bombers were shot down, and not a single torpedo struck a target. Within less than an hour, 3 American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. Although they inflicted no direct damage, their sacrifice proved decisive. First, their attacks forced the Japanese fleet to remain engaged in defense, preventing them from concentrating on an immediate counterstrike. Second, by drawing the Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude, they left the airspace above the fleet exposed, precisely where the American dive bombers were approaching. Earlier, the dive bomber group from Enterprise, led by Squadron Commander Clarence McCluskey, had struggled to locate the enemy. They reached the expected area but found no carriers. With fuel running low, McCluskey had to decide between turning back or pressing on a few more minutes. Spotting a lone Japanese destroyer racing southwest at high speed, he chose to follow. That decision led his group directly to the main Japanese carrier force. At 10:20 a.m., while Japanese Zeros were still engaged at low altitude against the last torpedo planes, 31 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise appeared at 10,000 feet over the southwest flank of the Japanese formation. McCluskey gave the order to dive. The Dauntlesses rolled over and plunged almost vertically. The carrier Kaga was struck repeatedly, including one bomb that penetrated the hangar deck packed with fueled and armed aircraft. Explosions ripped through the ship, and Kaga was quickly engulfed in flames. At the same time, the flagship Akagi was hit by a critical bomb that exploded inside the hangar deck, setting the ship ablaze. Almost simultaneously, dive bombers from Yorktown struck the carrier Soryu, igniting uncontrollable fires. In just 5 to 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's main carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were fatally hit and effectively destroyed. On board, fully armed aircraft waiting to launch fueled massive secondary explosions, tearing apart the ship's structures. The decks erupted in successive blasts, and entire command staffs were killed within moments. Survivors either abandoned ship or attempted in vain to fight the spreading fires. On the remaining Japanese vessels, crews stood in shock as the scale of the disaster unfolded before their eyes. News reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who at first refused to believe it. But the destruction of his striking force was undeniable. Within minutes, the core of Japan's carrier strength, responsible for Pearl Harbor and the expansion across the Pacific, was gone. Meanwhile, the American pilots of the SBDs saw towering columns of smoke rising from their targets. Regrouping quickly to conserve fuel, they turned back toward their carriers. The victory achieved in those few decisive minutes would alter the course of the entire Battle of Midway. On Hiryu's flight deck, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi quickly organized the remaining aircraft. At about 10:40 a.m., 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched toward the American fleet. Their first target was Yorktown, the carrier recently repaired after the Coral Sea and now operating alongside Enterprise and Hornet. Near noon, Yorktown's radar detected incoming aircraft. Alarms sounded. Anti-aircraft crews took positions, and the last remaining Wildcats scrambled to intercept. In the skies above, the Japanese formation clashed with American fighters. Several D-3As were shot down, but the rest pressed through and dove from over 10,000 feet onto Yorktown. 3 direct bomb hits shook the ship, setting fires and temporarily knocking out power. The carrier slowed and listed, flames rising from multiple sections. Damage control teams acted quickly. Within an hour, Yorktown had regained stability and could steam at near normal speed, appearing from a distance almost unharmed. At about 1:30 p.m., a second strike from Hiryu arrived. 10 Nakajima B 5N torpedo bombers with 6 Zero escorts. From altitude, the Japanese pilots were surprised to see what looked like an undamaged American carrier, believing Yorktown had already been destroyed in the earlier raid. In reality, it was the same ship, temporarily restored. Believing they faced a fresh target, the B-5Ns split into 2 groups, maneuvering for a pincer attack. On Yorktown, alarms blared once again. Anti-aircraft batteries and Wildcats fired into the approaching formation, downing several attackers, but others pressed on to release their torpedoes. From both sides, torpedoes struck the water in unison. 2 detonations thundered against Yorktown's port side, tearing open her hull. Seawater rushed in, The ship heeled heavily to port, her engines dead. Yorktown came to a halt in the middle of the Pacific, and her crew faced the grim reality that the carrier might sink at any moment. After the second Japanese strike withdrew, the sea grew quiet for a brief moment. Escorting vessels quickly moved to assist Yorktown. The carrier was disabled, but had not yet sunk. Its captain ordered the crew to abandon ship to save lives. Most men evacuated in lifeboats, while a small damage control party remained aboard. Remarkably, Yorktown stayed afloat through the night of June 4th, though in a critical condition. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots radioed back claiming they had sunk 2 American carriers, when in reality both attacks had struck only Yorktown. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu was initially encouraged by the report. Yet the situation was dire. Hiryu was now the sole operational Japanese carrier, with fewer than a full squadron of aircraft remaining. Yamaguchi resolved to continue fighting, prepared to launch one last strike. However, reconnaissance confirmed that at least 2 American carriers were still intact. Following the disastrous losses earlier that day, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had shifted his flag from Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, judged the battle unwinnable and ordered a general withdrawal westward. Bound by that decision, Yamaguchi canceled his planned attack and prepared for Hiryu to face the U.S. fleet alone. Late in the afternoon of June 4th, American scout planes finally located Hiryu heading west. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance immediately ordered a final strike. Around 5 p.m., 40 SBD Dauntless dive bombers launched from Enterprise and Hornet. Approaching the target, the Americans found Hiryu under full defensive measures, smoke screens, 13 remaining Zeros overhead, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Even so, the defenses could not stop the assault. Wave after wave of Dauntless bombers dove onto Hiryu. Anti-aircraft gunners shot down several attackers, but 4 heavy bombs struck the carrier. One penetrated into the engine room, causing massive internal explosions. Fires spread rapidly across the vessel, engulfing her in flames. Within minutes, Hiryu suffered the same fate as the other 3 carriers earlier in the day. Uncontrollable fires and secondary explosions ripping through her structure. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi remained calm. The final moments, he refused evacuation, choosing to stay with his ship. Captain Tomeo Kaku also elected to remain. By sunset, Hiryu was ablaze from stem to stern, a burning wreck against the darkening sky. Throughout the night, Japanese destroyers evacuated surviving crew and the wounded. At dawn on June 5th, with the ship beyond saving, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes to scuttle Hiryu, ensuring she did not fall into enemy hands. The last surviving Japanese carrier at Midway slipped beneath the waves, taking with her Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, Captain Kaku, and many officers who had chosen to go down with their ship. On the night of June 4th, the Japanese fleet withdrew westward, abandoning its ambition to capture Midway. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. forces, chose not to pursue in the darkness, wary of submarine ambushes or long-range Japanese airstrikes from bases such as Wake Island. He instead conserved his strength, waiting for daylight to continue the hunt. At dawn on June 5th, American reconnaissance aircraft fanned out across the seas around Midway. Most of the Japanese fleet was already out of reach. Yet in retreat, 2 heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma of Cruiser Division 7, suffered a serious accident. While maneuvering to avoid a U.S. submarine, they collided. Mikuma sustained severe bow damage and slowed dramatically, falling behind with only a few destroyers for escort. Mogami, with her stern badly crushed, struggled to keep pace, limping westward. By midday on June 6th, American scout planes from Enterprise located the damaged cruisers. Spruance immediately launched strike groups from Enterprise and Hornet. Dive bombers swooped down, hitting Mikuma with multiple direct hits. The cruiser erupted in flames, towering black smoke marking her death before she finally sank. Mogami was also struck and set ablaze, but avoided catastrophic hits and managed to limp away toward the southwest. Assessing the risks of venturing deeper into Japanese-controlled waters, Spruance called off further pursuit and consolidated his forces. On the morning of June 7th, tragedy struck the Americans. After 2 days of desperate salvage work, Yorktown was still afloat despite crippling damage. While destroyers and rescue parties labored to stabilize her, the Japanese submarine I-168 managed to slip past the protective screen. It fired a spread of torpedoes into the U.S. formation. Yorktown was hit multiple times, sealing her fate. The destroyer USS Hamon, alongside providing power and pumping support, was also struck and sank rapidly, taking many crew with her. Though most of Yorktown's men were evacuated, the carrier slowly rolled and sank into the depths of the Pacific, her brief but notable combat career ending less than a month after Coral Sea. After 4 days of ferocious combat, June 4th to 7th, 1942, the Battle of Midway came to a close. The Pacific Ocean was littered with oil slicks and drifting wreckage, the remnants of one of World War II's most decisive naval engagements. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and the heavy cruiser Mikuma destroyed. Over 3,000 officers and sailors killed, including many of the veteran aviators who had spearheaded Pearl Harbor. It was a blow the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from. The United States paid its own price, the loss of the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer Hamon, and roughly 300 men. Yet in return, America gained a decisive victory. Midway erased the shadow of defeat left by Pearl Harbor and galvanized the morale of the U.S. military and public. More importantly, the battle permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. With its carrier force shattered, Japan was forced onto the defensive across nearly every front. The U.S., by contrast, seized the initiative, beginning a series of counteroffensives that would start with Guadalcanal just 2 months later. Midway became the strategic turning point of the Pacific War. It marked the irreversible decline of Imperial Japan's naval dominance and the rise of American offensive momentum. The victory also stood as a tribute to the courage and sacrifice of the aviators and sailors who gave their lives to secure history's verdict amid the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. After Midway, victory did not end the war at sea. For the next 2 years, countless clashes erupted between the U.S. and Japanese navies, from the Solomons to Santa Cruz and Guadalcanal. Japan fought desperately to hold on to its fading control of the ocean, while the United States grew stronger, armed with new carriers, new aircraft, and unmatched industrial power. By mid-1944, the 2 fleets met again, this time in the Philippine Sea, in what would become the battle that erased Japan's naval air power forever. Nearly 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the balance of the Pacific War had completely changed. The Americans, once on the defensive, had shifted to the offensive, applying their island-hopping strategy to move step by step closer to the Japanese homeland. The landing on Saipan in the Mariana Islands was the decisive point. If Saipan fell, Japan would lose its shield, and its major cities would, for the first time, lie within the strategic bombing range of the B-29. Faced with this danger, the Japanese Imperial General Staff was forced to gamble the entire remainder of its fleet. Admiral Toyota Somu launched Operation Eigo, hoping to turn the tide with a decisive fleet engagement in the spirit of Kantai Kessen. Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo committed 9 aircraft carriers with about 500 aircraft, supported by 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and more than 30 destroyers, along with nearly 300 planes from nearby island bases, in the hope of breaking the American advance. Opposing them was the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, with Task Force 58 commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The Americans deployed 15 aircraft carriers with nearly 900 aircraft, protected by 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and nearly 60 destroyers. With such a powerful force, the United States entered the battle with overwhelming superiority. Both sides understood clearly. The coming naval battle would not only decide the fate of the Marianas, but also determine the course of the entire Pacific War. And in just 2 short days, the ocean would witness the largest carrier battle in history, an event remembered by later generations with a chilling name: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dawn of June 19, 1944. On the flagship Taiho, Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo scanned the horizon, certain that the American fleet was hidden somewhere to the east. At 4:45 a.m., he ordered the first reconnaissance planes to take off. The Americans launched their own scouts almost simultaneously. By 5:50 a.m., a Japanese Zero had sighted the U.S. fleet. The pilot quickly transmitted the coordinates, then dove in to attack a destroyer, only to be shot down by a wall of anti-aircraft fire. It was the opening shot of the battle. Alerted, Japanese squadrons stationed on Guam rushed to prepare for launch, but American radar had already picked them up. Alarms rang out across the carriers. From the deck of USS Belleau Wood, a flight of F-6F Hellcats roared into the sky to intercept. At Orote Airfield, Japanese planes were still lifting off when the Hellcats struck. The clash was brief and brutal. In less than an hour, 35 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while the Americans lost only 1 Hellcat. The survivors were forced to abandon their mission and retreat. With the threat from Guam eliminated, the U.S. could now focus on Ozawa's main force. On the flagship USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher calmly monitored the radar. At 8:30 a.m., the screens lit up with hundreds of contacts approaching from the west. Ozawa's strike groups were on their way. 3 separate waves had been launched: 69 aircraft from Force C, 128 from Force A, and 47 from Force B. In less than an hour, Japan had dispatched a total of 244 aircraft toward the American fleet. By 10 a.m., U.S. radar picked up the first wave at a distance of 240 kilometers. Mitcher immediately ordered every Hellcat into the air and recalled patrols from near Guam. In the Japanese formation, pilot Masatoshi Nakagawa led a group of dive bombers searching for the enemy carriers. When the force was about 100 kilometers from its target, impatience led them to pause and regroup, a fatal error. At 10:36 a.m., American Hellcats pounced from above. The sky erupted. Within minutes, 25 Japanese planes were shot down at the cost of 1 Hellcat. Another 16 soon followed. Many of the remaining aircraft jettisoned their bombs in desperation to escape. A handful that broke through were met by the full weight of U.S. naval anti-aircraft fire. Hundreds of 5-inch and 40-millimeter guns opened up, proximity-fused shells filling the air with deadly fragments. 1 bomb slammed into the deck of the battleship USS South Dakota, shaking the vessel violently and killing or wounding more than 50 sailors. Yet her heavy armor prevented disaster. Fires were quickly contained, and she remained in formation. Not a single Japanese plane reached the American carriers. By the end of the first wave of the 69 Japanese aircraft involved, 42 had been destroyed, and only 27 made it back to their carriers. The sky fell briefly quiet, but everyone knew this was only the opening phase of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On the carrier Zuikaku, Japanese crews hurriedly prepared for another strike. Ozawa, still confident, decided to commit the remainder of his main force. At 9 a.m., he ordered the launch of a second strike, this time with 129 aircraft. Near midday at 11:07, U.S. radar once again lit up, detecting a large mass of planes approaching from the southwest. The American pilots were already waiting, at a distance of 60 miles, 97 kilometers offshore, before they could even sight the enemy fleet. The Japanese formation was met by Hellcats diving in with ferocious attacks. Within minutes, about 70 Japanese planes were shot down before they ever reached the U.S. ships. A small number broke through and split into groups to carry out scattered attacks. 6 dive bombers plunged toward Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery's carriers, dropping bombs near USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill, starting fires and causing several casualties. Fortunately for the Americans, the bombs landed close but not directly on target, so the damage was minor. Another group of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers launched against USS Enterprise, the prime target Japan had long hoped to sink. But every torpedo missed. 3 more torpedo bombers attempted to strike USS Princeton, only to be blown apart by anti-aircraft fire as soon as they appeared. By the end of the second wave, the Japanese had suffered catastrophic losses. 97 of the 129 aircraft never returned. At noon, the sun beat down on the Philippine Sea, its light glinting off slicks of oil on the water. Yet the Japanese persisted. At 1 p.m., Ozawa launched a third strike from the north with 47 planes, hoping to hit the U.S. flank. But 80 kilometers from the fleet, they ran into 40 Hellcats. Taken by surprise, the formation scattered and quickly collapsed. Only 7 aircraft were shot down, far fewer than in the earlier waves. But the survivors abandoned their mission, dumping bombs into the sea before retreating. 40 planes managed to return safely, a rare stroke of luck for Ozawa that day. Still unwilling to concede, Ozawa committed his last reserves. Between 11 a.m. and 11:30 a.m., the carriers launched a fourth and final strike with 84 aircraft. Fate, however, intervened. Faulty intelligence had given the Japanese pilots the wrong coordinates for the American fleet. They searched fruitlessly as their fuel dwindled. Unable to return without completing the mission, commanders ordered the formation to split. One group to Guam, the other to Rota for refueling. The withdrawal was anything but safe. The group heading for Rota blundered into Rear Admiral Montgomery's task force. American Hellcats rose to intercept. In the brief clash, 18 Japanese planes were engaged. Only half escaped, while 9 were shot down. At the same time, 9 Japanese dive bombers made a desperate attempt on Wasp and Bunker Hill. Their bombs splashed close alongside, sending water high onto the decks, but caused no real damage. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed 8 of them. Only 1 got away. At Guam, the situation was even worse. As the remaining Japanese aircraft landed to refuel, 27 Hellcats from U.S. carriers swept in. With no time to take off and fight back, the Japanese planes were slaughtered on approach and over the airfield. In just minutes, 30 more aircraft were destroyed, and many of the survivors were so badly damaged they could no longer fight. By the afternoon of June 19, 1944, the smoke of battle had begun to clear, revealing devastation across the Philippine Sea. In just a single day of combat, Japan had suffered unprecedented losses. About 330 aircraft destroyed, including most of the land-based planes from the Marianas and nearly half of the carrier air groups under Ozawa. In contrast, the Americans lost only 23 planes, with their fleet virtually untouched aside from some casualties aboard the Battleship South Dakota and minor damage to a few other ships. Watching Japanese aircraft fall in droves, one U.S. pilot remarked, "It's like an old turkey shoot." From that moment, the battle acquired its infamous nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In one day, the elite of Japan's naval air power was nearly wiped out. Yet the disaster for Japan was far from over. As night fell, towering flames still burned on the horizon, the dying pyres of 2 Japanese carriers. While fierce air battles raged above, U.S. submarines had silently struck below. Early that morning, USS Albacore had detected Ozawa's flagship Taiho and moved in for the kill. At 8:15 a.m., just as Taiho was launching aircraft for its second strike, Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. Lookouts on Taiho spotted the white wakes and shouted warnings. The carrier turned sharply as escorts dropped depth charges. In the chaos, a Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu, having just taken off, saw an incoming torpedo and deliberately rammed it, detonating it at the cost of his own life. Taiho avoided one fatal hit, but another torpedo slammed into her starboard side, ripping open a gash that allowed aviation fuel to flood the compartments. The ship staggered, but, thanks to its advanced design, managed to continue steaming for several hours. By midday, tragedy struck again. USS Kavala had shadowed the veteran carrier Shokaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and many major battles. At 11:23 a.m., while Shokaku was busy recovering aircraft and refueling, Kavala loosed a spread of torpedoes. At least 3 struck home, setting off massive explosions in the hangar. Fuel and ordnance ignited, creating a fireball that engulfed the bow. The order to abandon ship was given. At 2:08 p.m., a final catastrophic blast tore the carrier apart. Shokaku broke in two and sank, taking 1,263 sailors and airmen with her. About 570 survivors, including Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, were rescued by escorting ships. Meanwhile, aboard Taiho, her crew worked desperately to contain the damage, sealing bulkheads and flooding compartments with CO2. For hours, it seemed she might survive. But a critical mistake sealed her fate. A damage control officer, lacking experience, ordered the ventilation system run at full power to clear fuel vapors. Instead, it spread volatile gasoline fumes throughout the ship. At 5:32 p.m., a spark from a generator triggered catastrophe. A chain of internal explosions ripped through the vessel, tearing apart elevators and decks. Flames shot hundreds of meters into the sky as Taiho, pride of the Japanese fleet, shook violently and slipped beneath the waves. Admiral Ozawa barely escaped, transferring his flag to a destroyer. The carrier went down with 1,650 of her crew. In a single day, Japan had lost 2 of its most important carriers to submarine attacks. At dawn on June 20th, after a night of disaster, the remnants of Ozawa's force retreated westward, hoping to escape. But the Americans pressed the pursuit. Admiral Spruance ordered his fleet to steam at full speed through the night. By morning, dozens of U.S. scout planes swept the ocean in search of the enemy. On the carrier Zuikaku, the sole survivor of Pearl Harbor still afloat, Ozawa transferred his flag at 1 p.m. That was when he finally learned the full extent of the previous day's failure. All 4 attack waves had been annihilated, and his carrier air groups were down to roughly 150 operational planes. What he did not know, because his subordinates hid the truth, was that nearly all of the land-based aircraft on Guam and Rota had also been destroyed. In ignorance, Ozawa still clung to the idea of mounting another strike on June 21st. By midday on June 20th, the skies were clear, but American scout planes had still not located the enemy. All morning and into the early afternoon, Mitcher grew restless as report after report came in with the same message: no contact. Finally, at 3:40 p.m., a scout from USS Enterprise sighted the Japanese fleet on the horizon and rushed back a vague signal. Mitcher demanded precise coordinates, and at 4:05 p.m., the confirmation arrived. The Japanese were 275 miles to the west, moving at 20 knots. Time was slipping away. The sun would set around 6:30 p.m., leaving less than 2 hours. A decisive order was given across the American carriers. Launch all aircraft. It was a dangerous gamble, as the strike would fly at the very edge of their range and almost certainly return after dark. But Mitcher and his commanders recognized this as the moment to deliver the killing blow. The decks shook as nearly the entire Task Force 58 took to the air, 226 planes in total, 95 Hellcats armed with 500-pound bombs, 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 77 dive bombers, both Helldivers and Dauntlesses. Wave after wave climbed into the sky and sped westward in pursuit of Ozawa's battered force. At about 6 p.m., while the Japanese fleet was refueling, lookouts suddenly spotted dark shapes approaching from the east. Sirens wailed. Ozawa scrambled his last 35 Zero fighters into the air. The escorts tightened formation, anti-aircraft crews loaded their guns. Minutes later, the roar of American engines filled the sky, and the assault began. The first U.S. squadron stumbled across 3 Japanese oilers trailing behind the main fleet. With fuel running low, some groups struck immediately. Bombs tore into the vulnerable tankers, setting 2 ablaze and breaking another in half. Columns of fire lit the horizon, and Ozawa could only watch in fury as his precious supply ships went up in flames. Then the full weight of the American strike fell on the carriers. On Hiryu, officers barely had time to shout, "Enemy aircraft port side!" before torpedoes slammed into the hull. Avengers from USS Belleau Wood had slipped through the defensive screen and scored at least 2 hits. Hiryu shuddered violently, smoke engulfing her decks. Fire spread too quickly to be controlled. Within 2 hours, a massive explosion ripped her apart. The carrier broke in 2 and sank, taking 250 sailors with her, though over 1,000 were rescued by destroyers. Elsewhere, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda were also hit. Thick smoke rose from their decks, though most of the bombs detonated close alongside rather than on target, sparing them total destruction. The battleship Haruna was struck on a main turret, killing and wounding many, but quick action to flood the magazines prevented a catastrophic detonation. After half an hour of relentless bombardment, the attack subsided. Japan had lost 3 vital oilers and the carrier Hiryu, while the other carriers were damaged. American losses were about 20 planes. Ozawa stood on Zuikaku's bridge, stunned as black smoke billowed across his shattered fleet. The dream of a decisive battle to turn the tide had collapsed. For the Americans, the mission was not over. Now their aviators had to make it back in the dark after flying nearly 300 miles. At 8:45 p.m., the first returning aircraft appeared. Landing on carriers at night after such a long sortie was nearly impossible. On USS Hornet, Rear Admiral Joseph Clark ordered floodlights switched on to guide the pilots. Mitcher then made the bold choice to illuminate the entire fleet, exposing them to risk, but giving his flyers a chance to land. Searchlights swept the sky. Destroyers fired flares to light the sea, and one by one, exhausted planes came down. Some pilots, out of fuel, crash-landed on the first deck they saw. Others ditched in the ocean or bailed out. Rescue operations continued through the night. By dawn, 80 aircraft had been lost to crashes or fuel exhaustion, but 3/4 of the air crews survived, many plucked from the sea. Mitcher was deeply aware of the cost. This was the price of his gamble at sunset. That same night at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Toyota read the final reports. The outcome was undeniable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended in disaster. He ordered Ozawa to withdraw. The U.S. fleet pursued briefly, then halted, having secured its victory and safeguarded the Saipan landings. After 2 days of combat, the Philippine Sea had witnessed the largest carrier battle in history. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 waves. Only 130 returned, many later lost with their ships. Including land-based planes and submarine attacks, Japan's total losses were between 475 and 550 aircraft, virtually its entire elite carrier air arm. Ozawa was left with barely 35 planes. In ships, the toll was equally devastating. 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hiryu, and 2 oilers destroyed, with the surviving carriers damaged. The Americans, by comparison, suffered negligible losses. No ships sunk, only South Dakota slightly damaged, and 123 planes lost, most to nighttime accidents rather than enemy fire. The result was nothing less than an overwhelming American victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, mockingly remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, delivered a mortal blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy. In just 2 days, the core of Japan's elite naval air power was annihilated, along with thousands of veteran pilots and mechanics. After this defeat, Japan would never again be able to assemble a carrier force strong enough to challenge the U.S. Navy in open battle. 4 months later, at the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf, Ozawa still nominally commanded Japan's carrier force. Yet his carriers had virtually no planes left. They sailed only as decoys, a desperate and tragic ruse to lure the American fleet away from the real fight. Strategically, the victory at the Philippine Sea opened the door for the Allies to seize the Mariana Islands. Soon after, Saipan fell, tearing a fatal breach in Japan's so-called absolute defense line. From the airfields on the Marianas, American B-29 bombers began launching devastating raids, reducing Japanese cities to burning ruins. In every sense, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944 marked the confirmation of America's absolute naval supremacy in the Pacific, and heralded the inevitable decline of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War. After the devastating defeat in the Philippine Sea, Japan's naval air power was shattered. Its veteran pilots were gone, and its once mighty carriers had become empty shells of steel. Yet the Empire of Japan still refused to surrender. 4 months later, as American forces landed in the Philippines, Tokyo launched everything it had left, a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. Over the waters of Leyte, the largest naval battle in human history was about to begin. A final confrontation that would decide the fate of the Pacific. It would be the greatest sea battle ever fought, and the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a decisive turning point. After years of grueling island-hopping campaigns, the U.S. and Allied forces finally closed in on the once impenetrable defensive perimeter of Japan. At the heart of this defense lay the Philippines, a chain of islands whose importance could not be overstated. In 1942, the archipelago had fallen to Japan after the bitter defeat at Bataan and the infamous Death March, leaving a deep scar on American pride. Yet beyond symbolism, the Philippines was Japan's lifeline. Through it flowed oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber and tin from Malaya and Burma. If the Allies severed this artery, Japan would be cut off from its vital resources, its fleet starved of fuel, its armies slowly strangled. General Douglas MacArthur had long understood this reality. For him, the Philippines was not only a military objective, but also a personal debt of honor. In 1942, as Japanese forces overwhelmed Luzon, he had been forced to retreat to Australia. From the deck of a small boat, MacArthur gave his legendary vow, "I shall return." Now, 2 years later, the moment had come to fulfill it. On October 20th, 1944, under heavy bombardment, tens of thousands of American troops stormed the beaches of Leyte. Tanks and artillery rolled ashore behind wave after wave of infantry. Wading through the surf, MacArthur himself set foot on the sand and proclaimed the liberation of the Philippines had begun. For Tokyo's high command, the landing was an earthquake. If Leyte fell, Japan's entire Southeast Asian defense network would collapse. In desperation, they prepared to stake everything on one last gamble, committing nearly all that remained of the Imperial Navy to a massive counterstroke. The plan called for a three-pronged assault. The Central Force, the strongest, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, would push through the San Bernardino Strait into Leyte Gulf. To the south, Vice Admirals Shoji Nishimura and Kiyohide Shima would lead two converging squadrons through the Surigao Strait. Meanwhile, to the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers would serve as sacrificial bait, luring the U.S. fleet away from Leyte. The Americans were equally prepared. Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet, built around fast carrier task forces, stood ready to deliver the decisive blow. At the same time, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid's Seventh Fleet focused on shielding the invasion force directly. The imbalance of strength was overwhelming. The Japanese entered the battle with fewer aircraft than the total number of American warships deployed across Philippine waters. By late October 1944, around the islands of Leyte and Samar, the die was cast. The largest naval battle in human history was about to erupt, a clash spanning hundreds of miles of ocean where the fate of two empires would be sealed in fire, steel, and blood. On the night of October 22nd and into the early hours of October 23rd, 1944, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the giant battleships Yamato and Musashi, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers, quietly moved through the Palawan Passage. But their secrecy did not last. At 0016, the American submarine USS Darter detected the Japanese formation on radar and began shadowing it. At 0524, Darter fired a spread of 6 torpedoes, at least 4 of which struck Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago. The ship sank within minutes, forcing Kurita to abandon ship before being rescued by a destroyer and transferring his flag to the battleship Yamato. Moments later, Darter hit another 2 torpedoes into the cruiser Takao, crippling it so badly that it had to retreat to Singapore and was removed from the battle. Meanwhile, the submarine USS Dace launched its own attack, sinking the cruiser Maya. In just a few short hours, Japan's Spearhead lost 2 modern cruisers and exposed its movements. The report sent back from Darter gave the Americans crucial insight into enemy intentions, prompting the U.S. Third Fleet to place all carrier groups on full alert. On the morning of October 24th, as Kurita's fleet advanced into the Cibuan Sea, it entered the range of American carrier aircraft. Beginning around 8 a.m., waves of F-6F Hellcat fighters, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes roared in from the carriers of the Third Fleet. Though Halsey's full carrier force was not present, some task groups were detached for resupply. 3 carrier groups still struck with overwhelming force. The first wave alone scored bomb hits on the battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi, while also disabling the cruiser Myoko. Subsequent attacks concentrated on Musashi, the pride of the Japanese Navy. Dozens of bombs and torpedoes slammed into the giant ship, flooding compartments and forcing it to fall behind the formation. By late afternoon, under relentless air assault, Kurita temporarily ordered his fleet to turn back, giving the Americans the false impression that the center force was retreating. But at 7:30 p.m., after enduring nearly 20 bomb and 20 torpedo hits, Musashi finally capsized and sank beneath the Cibuan Sea, taking over 1,000 crew with her. Despite the loss of Musashi and damage to several other ships, most of Kurita's heavy units remained combat-ready. He had merely pulled back to await a better opportunity to strike. While Halsey's carriers pounded Kurita's fleet, the Japanese launched their own counterattack from the skies. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi sent about 200 planes from Luzon to strike at the American carrier groups. Most were intercepted and destroyed by Hellcats, with ace pilot David McCampbell famously shooting down 9 aircraft in a single sortie. Still, one Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber broke through and at 9:38 a.m. dropped a 250-kilogram bomb onto the light carrier USS Princeton. The bomb punched through the flight deck, igniting fires in the hangar. At 3:23 p.m., massive secondary explosions, likely from stored ordnance, ripped the carrier apart, sending a huge column of smoke and flame skyward. The cruiser USS Birmingham, which had come alongside to assist, suffered heavy damage and over 300 casualties from the blast. Finally, at 5:50 p.m., with no hope of saving her, the destroyer USS Reno fired torpedoes to scuttle Princeton. It was the first U.S. carrier lost in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By nightfall on October 24th, the clash over the Cibuan Sea had come to a close. Kurita's fleet had temporarily withdrawn to the west, while Halsey shifted his focus northward, where Japan's Decoy carrier force had just revealed itself, setting the stage for the next dramatic phase of the largest naval battle in history. On the night of October 24th, and into the early morning of October 25th, 1944, the southern wing of the Japanese fleet steamed into Surigao Strait, directly into an ambush that the Americans had meticulously prepared. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura led 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. They had endured some air attacks on October 24th, but suffered only light damage. However, strict radio silence meant Nishimura could not coordinate with Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's force, which was 40 kilometers behind, nor with Kurita's main body far to the north. As a result, in the early hours of October 25th, Nishimura's force advanced alone into the strait, unaware that a layered trap awaited them. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the American defenses in Surigao Strait under the 7th Fleet, had arranged a textbook ambush. At the entrance, 39 PT boats patrolled to harass and report enemy movements. Behind them, destroyer squadrons waited on both flanks of the narrow channel. And blocking the far end of the strait stood Oldendorf's battle line, 6 battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania. Most had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, but were now resurrected, rebuilt with modern radar fire control systems. Oldendorf planned to execute the classic crossing the T maneuver, pouring concentrated fire across the Japanese line of advance. At 22:36 on October 24th, American PT boats made first contact, darting in and launching torpedoes. For over 3 hours, they harassed Nishimura's ships. None of their torpedoes hit, but they forced the Japanese to maneuver and sent back continuous reports to Oldendorf. By 3 a.m. on October 25th, the Japanese column had entered deep into the strait. Then American destroyers surged from both flanks, unleashing spreads of torpedoes. Disaster struck. Both Fuso and Yamashiro were hit. Fuso exploded violently, breaking in 2, with part of the burning wreckage left floating. Yamashiro also took hits, but, with frantic damage control, managed to press forward. 2 of Nishimura's destroyers were sunk outright, and another, Asagumo, was crippled and forced to withdraw, later sinking from damage. At 3:53, the battleship USS West Virginia locked onto targets with her radar at 21 kilometers and fired the opening salvo. Her 16-inch shells screamed through the darkness and struck Yamashiro within seconds. Instantly, the rest of Oldendorf's line joined in. California and Tennessee loosed 14-inch broadsides, while Maryland added 48 more 16-inch shells. The night sky over Surigao blazed with arcs of red fire. The Japanese, lacking radar fire control, were blind. They could barely see their enemies, let alone return accurate fire. Within minutes, Nishimura's force was annihilated under a storm of shells. Yamashiro absorbed dozens of heavy hits before capsizing and sinking around 420, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and nearly all his crew down with her. The cruiser Mogami and destroyer Shigur turned and fled south. Mogami limped away badly damaged, while Shigur was the lone survivor of Nishimura's squadron, the only witness to the total destruction of Japan's southern force in the inferno of Surigao Strait. Not long after Nishimura's force had been annihilated, Japan's second southern contingent under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima arrived at the mouth of Surigao Strait, about 40 kilometers behind. His force included the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashigara and 8 destroyers. Seeing the burning wreckage ahead, in fact the two halves of the shattered battleship Fuso, Shima was stunned. Realizing the fate of the advance force, he immediately ordered a retreat, thus ending any hope of a Japanese breakthrough from the south. In the confusion of turning back, Shima's flagship Nachi collided with the damaged cruiser Mogami, crippling the latter and forcing it to fall behind. The next morning, American aircraft finished off Mogami offshore, while Nachi and the other ships that escaped would themselves be destroyed in subsequent air raids not long afterward. The Battle of Surigao Strait thus ended by dawn on October 25th with a decisive Allied victory. It marked the last battleship-to-battleship engagement in naval history, and the final successful execution of the legendary Crossing the T maneuver. Japan's southern force was virtually wiped out. Of Nishimura's 7 ships, only the destroyer Shigur escaped, while Nishimura himself went down with his flagship. Shima's force accomplished nothing, retreating in failure. Yet while the southern thrust had been crushed, events to the north of Leyte Gulf suddenly turned dangerous for the Allies. Admiral William Halsey, lured by the threat of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's decoy carrier force, had led all 3 of his fast carrier task groups northward on the night of October 24th to chase Ozawa. He even took with him Task Force 34, Vice Admiral Willis Lee's powerful battleship group, leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. At 7th Fleet headquarters, commanders assumed Halsey had left heavy ships to cover the strait, but in truth, the northern gateway to Leyte Gulf lay wide open. And that was precisely the opportunity Kurita had been waiting for. At around 3 o'clock on October 25th, Kurita led his center force, 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 cruisers and numerous destroyers, through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Sweeping around the eastern side of Samar Island, the Japanese fleet turned south, intending to strike the Allied landing forces at Leyte from the north. The only units in their path were the small escort carrier groups of the U.S. 7th Fleet, known by the code name Taffy. There were 3 such groups, Taffy 1, 2, and 3. Each contained 4 to 6 escort carriers, for a total of 16 carriers operating about 450 planes, supported by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These baby carriers were slow, thinly armored, and carried mostly anti-submarine planes and light ground attack aircraft, not designed for fleet combat. Their escorts were lightly armed, barely suited to stand against battleships and heavy cruisers. By contrast, Kurita's center force, though damaged in earlier battles, remained one of the most powerful fleets afloat, second only to the U.S. carrier arm. The battleship Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons, roughly equal to the combined weight of all 16 ships of Taffy 3. a hopelessly uneven confrontation loomed. A clash between a predator and its helpless prey, a tiger against lambs. What neither side yet realized was how extraordinary the coming fight would become. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, as the Japanese fleet crept toward the coast of Samar, a lookout aboard the super battleship Yamato suddenly spotted the silhouettes of American carrier masts on the horizon. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita instantly believed he had stumbled upon Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet carriers. Exultant, he signaled headquarters. "Heaven has given us the chance to strike the American fleet. Attack the carriers first, then destroy the rest." In reality, what lay ahead was not Halsey's main force, but Task Unit Taffy 3 under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. Only 6 small escort carriers, each carrying about 28 planes, protected by 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. This modest unit was providing direct air support for the Leyte landings. At about 6:45, aboard the flagship Fanshawe Bay, American sailors suddenly saw towering columns of black smoke and the looming shapes of massive Japanese warships to the northwest. Alarm klaxons shrieked across the formation. Though shocked, Sprague reacted instantly. He ordered all carriers to turn south at maximum speed while launching every aircraft immediately, even without full armament loads. A sudden squall nearby offered precious cover. The American ships ducked into the rain curtain while their destroyers laid thick smoke screens to shield the vulnerable carriers. The deadly chase at Samar had begun. Kurita, unaware that Ozawa's northern decoy force had already succeeded in drawing Halsey away, still thought he was facing the American main fleet. Initially ordering his ships into anti-air formations, he abruptly changed his mind. At 6:58 from Yamato's bridge, he gave the command, "General attack!" The Japanese line surged forward, abandoning cohesion, thundering toward Sprague's tiny force. The Yamato's 18.1-inch guns roared, hurling 1.6-ton shells that whistled through the sky and crashed into the sea around the escort carriers. The concussion was so immense that American ships tens of kilometers away shuddered. Sailors later said the shells sounded like freight trains rushing overhead. In that desperate moment, the Americans displayed astonishing valor. The destroyer USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest E. Evans, was closest to the enemy. Without waiting for orders, Evans broke formation, poured on speed, and charged directly into the Japanese fleet, smoke billowing from her stacks. Johnston fired a spread of torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her to fall back. But Johnston was soon struck by Yamato's massive guns, badly crippling her. Inspired by this act, Sprague issued his now famous command, "Small boys, attack!" At once, 3 more ships, the destroyers Hole and Hiryu and the escort destroyer Samuel B. Roberts, turned to engage an enemy force many times their size. Hole launched torpedoes at the cruiser Haguro and fought furiously until silenced by fatal hits to her engine room. Hiryu pressed attacks against Haguro and even harassed the battleship Congo, loosing torpedoes and guns in a desperate gamble. The tiny Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, charged the cruiser Chokai, firing every 5-inch shell aboard and launching all her torpedoes. These reckless charges, aided by dense smoke screens, threw the Japanese into confusion. Their captains swerved frantically to evade torpedoes, slowing the pursuit. Yet the cost to Taffy 3 was devastating. Hole was pounded until she drifted helpless and went down under Congo's fire. Johnston, after hours of defiance, was smashed by dozens of heavy hits and sank with Evans, who would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. Samuel B. Roberts fought until out of ammunition, shattered by enemy salvos, and abandoned by her crew. Though outgunned and doomed, These small American ships had bought precious time. Their ferocious stand distracted and delayed Kurita's armada, giving the fragile escort carriers a chance to survive, and forcing one of the most powerful fleets in the world to falter in the waters off Samar. In the air, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid of the 7th Fleet and Rear Admiral Thomas Sprague, commander of the escort carrier groups, called for every aircraft from Taffy 1, 2, and 3, nearly 450 planes in total, to launch continuous strikes against the Japanese fleet. Armed with bombs, torpedoes, or only machine guns, wave after wave of American planes dove on the enemy. FM-2 Wildcats strafed at low altitude, while TBM Avengers dropped whatever ordnance they had, bombs, rockets, torpedoes, even depth charges or fuel tanks, onto Japanese decks. Lacking the support of Halsey's fast carrier air groups, these escort carrier pilots became the lifeline of their comrades, flying through intense anti-aircraft fire with reckless courage. Some attacks from Taffy 2 under Rear Admiral Felix Stump inflicted serious damage on the Japanese formation. All morning long, the skies over Samar blazed with engine roar, tracers, and explosions. The battle on the morning of October 25th was ferocious beyond measure. Despite the Americans' valiant resistance, many small ships took punishing hits. The escort carriers themselves were not spared. The Gambier Bay, trailing at the end of Taffy 3's line, came under concentrated fire from the heavy cruisers Chikuma and Chokai. Shells ripped through her thin decks, slowing her down and setting her ablaze. At 8:45, she rolled over and sank, the only American aircraft carrier in World War II ever sunk by naval gunfire. Other escort carriers, including Kalinin Bay, Kitkoon Bay, and White Plains, were also hit and damaged, but managed to lay smoke and continue fleeing. This desperate resistance achieved something vital. It convinced the Japanese that they were up against a powerful U.S. carrier force, perhaps even Halsey's main fleet, rather than mere escort carriers. Kurita's order for a general attack had already thrown his force into disarray. Ships lost contact and scattered in the chaos of pursuit, breaking their cohesion. Even Yamato was forced to maneuver hard to avoid incoming torpedoes, unintentionally pulling her out of action during the critical phase of battle. By about 9:20, Kurita abruptly ordered the pursuit halted and turned his fleet north to regroup. Japanese ships ceased fire, laid smoke, and withdrew under continued American air attacks. On the shattered, burning U.S. escort carriers, surviving sailors watched in disbelief as the enemy suddenly disengaged. Taffy 3 had held long enough to force the Japanese to abandon the fight. Yet Kurita was not finished. After regrouping at a safer distance around 11 a.m., he again turned south, seemingly determined to break into Leyte Gulf and smash the Allied invasion fleet. At that moment, however, a message reached him, later proven false intelligence, reporting a powerful U.S. carrier force moving down from the north. Believing this to be Halsey returning, and drawn by the chance to battle America's main fleet rather than transport ships, Kurita once more reversed course. That fateful decision inadvertently saved the entire Allied invasion force at Leyte. General Douglas MacArthur later admitted that, at that moment, dozens of fully loaded transport ships sat vulnerable in the Gulf. Had the Japanese broken through and destroyed them, over 100,000 U.S. troops ashore would have been left in dire jeopardy. But the opportunity slipped away. Chasing a phantom fleet to the north, Kurita eventually abandoned the effort. By late afternoon on October 25th, he ordered a full retreat, leading his battered force back through the San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, as the battle off Samar raged in the south, to the north off Cape Engano, Admiral Halsey struck the decisive blow against Ozawa's Decoy force. Ozawa's northern force was in truth pitifully weak. Only 4 carriers remained, among them Zuikaku, the last surviving fleet carrier from Pearl Harbor, and the light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. They were escorted by two old battleships, Ise and Hyuga, partially converted into hybrid carriers but without air groups, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Worse still, after catastrophic losses of trained aviators in previous battles, the 4 carriers together had fewer than 110 operational aircraft, nowhere near enough to threaten Halsey's mighty Third Fleet. Though Halsey had initially taken the bait and left Leyte unguarded, he also saw a golden opportunity to wipe out Japan's carrier arm once and for all. On the night of October 24th to 25th, he ordered 9 carriers, including the fleet carriers Enterprise, Essex, Intrepid, Franklin, Lexington, and 4 light carriers, along with 6 of America's most modern battleships, to race north toward Ozawa. At dawn on October 25th, Ozawa launched about 75 aircraft in a desperate strike against the Third Fleet. But, as with Onishi's raids from Luzon, nearly all were shot down by American Hellcats long before reaching their targets. Only a few limped back to base. Halsey responded with overwhelming force. Even before sunrise, 180 American planes had already been launched to locate and strike the enemy. At 7:10, U.S. scouts found Ozawa's fleet, and American squadrons immediately pounced. From 8 a.m. that morning until late afternoon, U.S. carriers flew 527 sorties, hammering the Japanese. The results were decisive. Nearly the entire remaining Japanese carrier force was annihilated. The flagship Zuikaku was struck and set ablaze. Her crew performed a final flag-lowering ceremony before she slipped beneath the waves at midday. The light carriers Chitos and Zuiho were also hit, exploding and sinking. Chiyoda was crippled and left adrift, only to be finished off the next day by cruisers and destroyers. The destroyer Akazuki, part of Ozawa's escort, was blown apart by bombs. What little remained of the northern force was powerless. Admiral Ozawa had to transfer his flag to the cruiser Oyodo to direct the retreat. Thus, Japan's last carrier decoy gambit backfired completely. In just a single morning, the Imperial Navy's final carrier striking force was virtually wiped out, while Halsey's fleet suffered only minimal losses. Although victorious in the north, Halsey soon faced grim news from the south. Beginning at 9 a.m. on October 25th, urgent messages poured in from Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, reporting that the escort forces off Samar were in desperate danger and pleading for the 3rd Fleet to come to their aid. It was not until around lasted just over 2 years. Yet it was enough to wipe out the most powerful navy in Asia. Japan lost more than 20 aircraft carriers, hundreds of warships, and nearly all of its elite pilots. The Pacific, once a symbol of imperial ambition, had become a silent graveyard of rusting steel. For the United States, it was the moment that defined a generation. When a nation rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to command the seas. Through resilience, discipline, and overwhelming industrial might, America reshaped the course of the war and ushered in a new era where it would rule the oceans of the world.